just checking it's recording. It is. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Pete Wills, Senior Principal Consultant with Senior. I've promoted you.
I've been promoted already.
With Resource Futures and Evidence Lead for Resource Futures. So I'm going to put myself on mute and just hand over to you. I know you're going to be sharing your screen, and obviously we'll send out the slides separately to the recording as well after the event. Okay, so over to you, Pete.
Great. Well, thank you very much for the introduction, Helen. And hopefully we can help to improve the confidence a bit as we go along this evening with some of the bits and pieces that we'll cover. Yeah, look forward to answering any questions later on. If there's bits and pieces that we can sort of help to answer any queries and questions for your specific events and activities. If there's any sound issues or anything like that, do just let me know as we go through. Great. Normally for these sorts of presentations, the first thing I do is talk about where fire exits are. So you're all in charge of your own fire exits tonight. If any alarms go off, it's not a drill, it's happening. So can everyone see my shared screen at the moment? Yeah, nods all round, that's great, excellent. Thank you all for joining this evening. And yeah, let's see if we can add a bit more confidence to getting events back up and running and helping to waste and reduce the amount of materials and items going to waste and improving and increasing reuse. So, let's see if I can actually move through my slides. Okay, so what I'll talk about to start with is I'll do a bit of an introduction about my background at Resource Futures and health and safety. We'll talk a little bit about risk assessments and what we've been doing over the last year, as Helen has said. We'll talk about the government's COVID easing roadmap and the steps that they've outlined. We're in step 2 at the minute. Step 3 and 4 are going to be the ones where we see some bigger changes happening, particularly step 3. It's going to be a big easing step before June. We'll then talk about some really key elements to COVID measures and what everyone will need to do. And that's around hygiene and social distancing measures, but also ventilation. So they're 3 really important things. Those crop up again and again and again in all of the guidance that's been put together and updated and changed throughout the course of the past year. And what we'll then do is we'll talk about different event types, broadly grouped into indoor and outdoor events, but we'll talk about and we'll touch on some specific different events that each of you is involved with. So Helen has already shared with me this evening excuse me, she's already shared with me this evening some of the groups that you're involved in and the sorts of activities that you do. So I've got a fairly good idea of the mix of activities that we have. And then thinking about other risks, that's quite an important point as well. So I've been at Resource Futures for over 10 years now. I've been working with risk assessments for most of that time in one capacity or another, whether that's actually being on the ground, carrying out things like doorstep surveys, recycling monitoring, actually sorting through waste and recycling. So I've been involved in those sorts of things for a long time. And in the past 2 and a bit years, I took on the health and safety advisor role at Resource Futures. So I had some training for that. So you may have heard of NEBOSH. That's a qualification in health and safety, which is quite an intensive 2-week course, followed by practical examinations and written assessments. I've also got an IOSH qualification as well, and that's the Institute of Occupational Safety and Health. So I'm supported in my work at Resource Futures by Polly White. So she's a junior consultant, and Polly is the health and safety assistant, and she supports me with lots of risk assessment tasks and guidance reading up and things. So why do we manage health and safety, or why are we legally obliged to manage health and safety? So we have some broad legal duties of care, and there's a couple of specific bits of regulation that those come under. So there's the 1974 Health and Safety at Work Act, and then there's the Management of Health and Safety at Work regulations. There's lots of other pieces of legislation and law that fit into that as well. You know, specific things like working at height and use of cranes and all sorts of things that we don't have to deal with too much, but there's lots of different laws in place. Generally, it's about duty of care. So that's as a company or business, you've got a duty of care to employees and those you work with and members of the general public And the organisations that we support, we have a duty to help and instruct and guide them too. As a company of more than 5 employees, we have to have a written policy and arrangement statement, and we have to have a system of risk assessments as well for everything that we do. So that's a bit about the background of health and safety. There's lots of different types of work that we do at Resource Future. So already we've got quite a broad background of managing risk and working with health and safety. So we do across the company, and things that I'm involved with are things like doorstepping and survey work, communications campaigns and communities work, waste and recycling advisors and waste doctors who speak to people about recycling, composition analysis and recycling analysis, where we separate out materials and we have teams that do that, recycling roadshows, visits to waste and recycling facilities. And we also have a real napping project where we have a pair of coordinators who help new mums and expectant mums to move and choose the path of using real nappies rather than disposables. And we've also got community repaint schemes, and that's a network of 70 different schemes, largely community run, who help to recycle and redistribute waste paint, or they stop it becoming waste paint. So we've got a really broad background, and I've got a really broad background of different aspects of managing risk across different activities. So specifics for CAG Devon. So as I mentioned, we've got our general duty of care, very key points for all of the CAG groups. You must provide, so each of the groups, to your volunteers, you must provide relevant health and safety information and general duty of care to volunteers and those that you're working with. So that's a kind of general overview from the top. That is an absolute point that everyone must be involved in. But we should also consider other activities and other interactions with members of the public and other individuals attending events. Now that's a wider duty of care. So you need to think about the visitors and the people that will be attending events as well. So there are 2 really key points there. And finally, for those of you that this applies to, if you are involved in using the CAG Devon insurance, then there's a legal duty and an insurance duty there to carry out risk assessments to make sure that that insurance is then valid. So there's all of these different points included in here. With the changes that have been brought in under the COVID legislation, various activities that are taking place also need to have risk assessments. So lots of people that have never been involved in completing risk assessments have had to start completing risk assessments to show what they're doing with COVID measures. So that's another point there. So I've mentioned risk assessments for each different type of activity. So if your CAG does a number of different activities, then you will need a different risk assessment for each of those. And within that risk assessment, you should cover different areas of risk. So for example, if you have people attending events and there's lots of vehicles arriving, then you should consider things about vehicles and parking. Do you need to have cones and signage in your car park as a general point? And then if you have people who are entering buildings, you need to cover the inside of the buildings as well, and think about risks in different areas. So for outside, different things that are going on, and then inside, different things that are going on. And we'll get into all of the COVID measures very shortly. And I know that you will all probably be quite aware of the sorts of things we're talking about there. You'll have all seen lots on the news over the past year. You'll have been in shops and supermarkets, I'm sure, and new shops or different shops that are now reopening, and you will have seen the sorts of things that are in place there, I'm sure. And there's still the need to manage those other risks. That's really important. So I work in the waste and recycling industry. There's lots of heavy machinery, lots of different facilities and movements of waste and recycling. And over the past year, the focus has shifted from those regular activities to COVID-19 measurements. But it's really important that we keep monitoring and evaluating and managing all of those other risks too. So, excuse me, we've already had some CAG groups carrying out activities already, which is great. It's been really good to help get those risk assessments together so that those can and have been taking place. So some of the repair cafes have been doing a sort of click and collect or drop off repairs, which is great. The community larders and community fridges have also been carrying on as well. and litter picks as well have also been continuing in some format. So outdoor events generally and those types of activities have been able to carry on. The indoor events are the ones that have really been hit by the COVID restrictions, and we'll talk about how to put things in place so we can get those going again. So the government's spring roadmap. So we've got a set of dates. So we had those dates early on in March, or early in March and late March, which was our step 1, which saw some of the restrictions being eased. So some types of shops started reopening, different business activities. The stay-at-home travel restriction was eased slightly. Excuse me. And so we've seen things starting to open back up and get going again with the vaccination rollout and given the long period of inactivity and stay-at-home guidance. So step 2 has kicked off, I think we're 2 weeks ago now. The biggest change under step 2 was that most retail was able to reopen. Pretty much all retail has been able to reopen. So lots of shops are opening back up. Pubs were able to reopen with outdoor service of food and drink. And the travel restrictions again have lifted. So people are now no longer being told to stay in their local area. Travel further afield as possible. Not a lot in step 2 has changed too many things for getting the CAGs reoperating again. So there weren't huge changes there that have made things more easily possible. Step 3 will take place, hopefully, from the 17th of May, not before the 17th of May, which is what we keep being told. But the 17th of May will be the big change in steps. And what I will do is we'll focus in a bit more closely on these next couple of slides. So don't worry too much about this. I know the print there is very small on these, so we'll talk about these in a bit more detail. So here's our step 2. So on the left-hand side, we've got some of the key easing measures, and on the right-hand side, there's a bit more detail about the sorts of measures we're talking about. And what I've done is I've just highlighted those that are most relevant to the CAG groups. So outdoor hospitality has started up again. All retail has started up again. We now have the rule of 6 back in place for social settings. So that means in a pub beer garden, you could have 6 people around a table, as long as they are, or a maximum of 2 different households if there's more than 6 people. And libraries and community centres have been able to reopen again. And I will talk about community centres in a bit more detail because community centres have got some attached exemptions around them as well. So there are only certain types of activity that are permitted to reopen in community centres at the moment. So going back to step 2, from 12th of April, some outdoor events with staggered arrival and departure were allowed to start up again, that also don't involve attendees converging for discrete performances or events. So car boot sales, community fairs, village fetes, very relevant to CAG, beach cleans and litter picks, that applies to, jumble trails, that potentially applies to, community gardening, tree planting, community fridges, and seed and plant swaps if they're taking place outdoors. So there's a number of different things. Now, what I've done is this is an interpretation of some of the guidance. So the way the guidance is set out is there's about 20 different guidance documents that are very specific for the retail sector, for education, for shops and branches. There's lots of overlap in what the CAGs groups do, which is brilliant and shows what a diverse network you have of different activities. But it does mean that we've had to look at lots of different parts of the guidance and pick those points which are most relevant to what the CAGs do. So on the outdoor events where you're not having a single activity or a single event or performance kicking off at 2 o'clock, we're having the opera start or whatever, those types of outdoor events can't go ahead, but something that starts throughout the course of the day or starts and then people arrive and go throughout the course of the day, like a car boot sale, those can resume. So we'll move on to, so other considerations for step 2, the rule of 6 applies, outdoors for social groups, no meeting of individuals from other households inside, so we're still not meant to be meeting other individuals in our houses. Now, community centres can reopen, but the phrasing is for essential voluntary services only. Some childcare activities can reopen in community centres, so parent and baby groups of up to 15 parents, they can resume. Now, outdoor hospitality with table service is the other key change that I mentioned for step 2. So we'll move on to step 3. So step 3, this is where the big changes are going to be happening from the 17th of May, as long as the figures and numbers keep moving in the right direction. And the big change is that indoor entertainment and attractions can open. That includes events as well. Some large capacity events could reopen. So indoor events potentially up to 1,000 people or 50% of maximum capacity. Even larger events are also proposed as well, so up to 4,000 or 10,000 with reduced numbers of people attending. And outdoors, we now have a limit of social groups of up to 30, and the rule of 6 will then apply for households. So you can be indoors with up to 6 people or 2 household groups. So there's quite a large set of changes for getting things going again. And a lot of other shops and any other retail activities can also start again. So anything that's still closed, so things like the bowling alleys can start up again as well. So we've talked about indoor hospitality with table service. Social distancing still applies. Indoor events and attraction, again, social distancing will still apply to these, and larger outdoor events taking place as well. So what does this mean for the CAG groups and specific events and activities that you will run outdoors or indoors as well? That would mean that from the 17th of May, with the right measures in place, repair cafes can reopen with repairers and attendees and visitors in person. So jumble sales indoors could start again. So clothes swaps and swishes could start again. And other training activities. So for example, pat testing, bike maintenance classes, sewing groups and classes, and tool maintenance groups. Libraries of things, I know this is an idea that's been discussed by a few different schemes, so potentially that could start again. If there was going to be a sort of in-person attendance of that. Library of things could potentially start sooner, but not with people attending that in any numbers other than a sort of click and collect or drop off type setup, like the repair cafes that are already going in some form at the minute. So that's a bit about the guidance and the roadmap and the steps that are in place. So step 4, the hope for step 4 is the 21st of June, which in theory could see everything being lifted and an opening up of everything, which I think would put us all on a course for massive celebrations, hopefully socially distanced still. But in theory, if the figures keep moving in the right way, the 21st of June is the date that's being looked at. My personal view is that I think we will still see some restrictions continuing for a bit longer. So I think indoor events, I think, will still have to have some social distancing measures, perhaps, but we shall have to see. So, 2 of the points that or 3 of the points I think I mentioned before were that for all events going forward, there are 3 key underlying themes which crop up again and again. So that is maintaining social distancing and improving social distancing, adding increased hygiene measures, and improving and increasing ventilation. So this is where our hands, space and face, which time and time again you will have seen on the government daily briefings, they've become less frequent now. What they've added to that is ventilation. So ventilation is the other thing to do. And that is as simple as opening and keeping windows and doors open and getting fresh air from outside in. And you can use fans to assist in doing that if needs be, but just opening doors and windows as much as possible. And as we're moving into the summer months, that becomes less of a problem. Clearly quite challenging to do in January and February, having all the doors and windows open, because you also have to wear 5 or 6 layers at the same time to do that. So these are really key points, and this will come into everything that we talk about for all events. The ventilation aspect is why outdoor events are clearly much easier to manage, because ventilation has been realised to be really important. So all CAG events must put in place and maintain measures to increase and maintain social distancing and prevent person-to-person transmission, so keeping people apart, that's in between two people transmitting COVID and passing it on. All events and activities should add appropriate additional hygiene measures to reduce the possibility of transmission from surfaces. So this is additional cleaning, and we'll talk about that in a bit more detail, and then increasing ventilation. So social distancing, I think we're all quite aware of what this involves now, and 2 meters is the distance that is still what we should all be aiming for. If you are able to use some additional mitigation measures, so typically face coverings, then it's okay to reduce that distance down to 1 meter. So we're saying 1 meter plus the addition of wearing face coverings. But so far as possible, we want to try to keep 2 meter social distancing in place. With the social distancing, it's important, if you're hosting events inside, that you think about all of the indoor areas that applies to. So if, for example, it's a school or a village or a church hall, you need to think about not only the church hall, you could have lots of doors and windows open, and you don't need a one-way system because it's nice and open and people can maintain distance. But you need to think about where people are going to access toilets. If there's food and drink available, you need to think about access to the kitchens and where food and drink is coming from. So it's really important that you're able to maintain and manage social distance in all those different areas of a building. Excuse me. So our increased hygiene measures, and there is no specific set number of times you need to clean something. So the measures are about being reasonable and pragmatic. So for example, if you have people attending a repair cafe and they're sat down at a table, the table needs to be clean before they sit down at it and in between the next person. And so when they finish and when they leave that table, the table needs to be wiped down and clean again. And you would clean it in between each different person that you have visiting. Other frequencies of what you're able to do with cleaning measures are dependent on how many people you have accessing the space. So if, for example, you have a jumble sale in a church hall, you might decide that actually it's possible every half an hour to wipe down the door handle that goes into that room. If you're not able to keep that door open, and if there's a surface or a counter that people have to touch or handle items as they move through. So there's nothing in the guidance that says you must do this after every 10 people, or you must clean every 30 minutes or every 20 minutes. So it's about putting in place things which are practical and manageable to do, that are reasonable. And we can talk about some specifics for these things later. If you've got questions on that, I'm more than happy to come up with some suggestions of what might work in your event, in your scenario. But you should think about things and surfaces that people are going to handle and touch often. So for example, main entry doors, if you have got doors shut, handrails, if people have to go upstairs, or any steps to access a building or inside a building, and counters, if people have to arrive at a counter and if they have to handle a counter or stop at a counter, then you should try to clean all of these surfaces a bit more often. And keep cleaning schedules. So if you have a cleaning schedule, it's easier to keep track of that and keep on top of that. It doesn't need to be anything fancy. It can just be a tick list that says, yep, every half hour we've gone, oh, half an hour has come up. It's 2:30. We need to go in and just do a quick wipe of the surfaces. And you should also do the same for toilet and wash facilities as well. So it's really important that toilet and wash facilities are staying open where you are able to host events indoors. So this will be from the 17th of May, but you should carry out additional cleaning in those areas because they are likely to have higher points of contact where people are going in with doors and handles and taps and things. What to use for cleaning and those additional hygiene measures. So antibacterial wipes, antibacterial, antiviral wipes, the better brands of these wipes generally will do both, and they're effective for both. Diluted sprays of disinfectant can also be used, but hot soapy water has also been shown to be quite effective as well. So hot soapy water is good as well. And indoors, a reminder and the final reminder on hygiene, mask wearing and face coverings is also another step which you'll need to keep taking indoors as well. Preferably with signage and reminders to make sure that people are wearing those on arrival. So that's general hygiene measures, general social distancing measures, and a bit on ventilation. What we'll do now is we'll talk about COVID secure steps by different activity types. And I'll start off by talking about outdoor activities, which some of those can take place now. Outdoor, as I've said, is much easier to manage because you've got that ventilation outdoors. It's easier to keep people apart, lots of air movement. So, for health and safety matters, you should treat the CAG volunteers as if they are employees. So that's quite an important point. If you're treating them as employees, the point to remember here, or the reason for this, is that you need or you must communicate with your volunteers what your measures are for COVID security. So you'll need to talk to them about the steps that you're taking to reduce the COVID risks, but you should also ask them about their views on that as well and get feedback. So the reason for that is it's been put into the legislation that you must ask and you must communicate before events with everyone who's involved. So that's really important that you are having those conversations about the measures that you're putting in place. Those measures are to protect everyone. So they're to protect the CAG group members, yourselves, they're to protect the volunteers, but they're also to protect the general public and the visitors as well. So everyone has a broad duty of care. So it's for everyone's benefit and protection. And at the moment, we all have a legal duty to comply with the national measures that are put in place. If we don't, we're all at risk of on-the-spot fixed penalty fines and potentially prosecutions for repeat offences. So the COVID Act that was brought in last year means that we are all subject to those restrictions. And as mentioned before, you will need a complete risk assessment, or you will need to complete a risk assessment for every activity. Now, the good news is that Helen and I and Polly have been working on those risk assessments for the past year, and we've been updating all of our risk assessments across all of the work that we do. So updating those risk assessments is now not such an onerous task. The onerous task was pulling apart the guidance and trying to understand what it all means and what you can and can't do, and we're pretty much there now. So we will be sharing those template risk assessments, and what you'll have at the top of each risk assessment, you'll have an outline of the sorts of measures you should put in place because of the activities that you do to manage COVID. What you'll need to do is have a look at those measures and think about what's relevant to what you do and where you do it. So think about the setting that you carry out your repair cafes at. Think about the setting where you'll be having jumble sales or jumble trails, and think about the points that will be important to what your group does and your activities. And you must put in place reasonable measures. So reasonably practicable is what we're talking about. You're not expected to do every single thing and every little detail. You will have to show that you've thought about the points that could cause issues. So for example, we talked about the door handles, or I talked about door handles before. You just need to put something in place to think about how you're going to do your additional cleaning. And as long as you're putting that into the risk assessment and then carrying that out, that should be sufficient and reasonable to make sure that you're taking the right steps. When we come to indoor activities, I'll talk about visitor numbers because that's a really important point. So we'll talk about visitor numbers and how to manage that and what's reasonable. So we'll talk about outdoor events. So a recap on the type of outdoor events and activities we're talking about. So car boot sales, community fairs, village fetes, beach and litter cleans and litter picks, jumble trails, which we're saying at the moment, outdoor only, community gardening, tree planting, community fridges, and seed and plant swaps as well. So these are all the outdoor activities that we're talking about for the moment. How to manage them. So to start with, things to do before the event. This is really important. So before the event, have a think about who will attend that. So your volunteers, we mentioned those first. So to start with, you should provide your volunteers with some information. Now that could be an email if that works for you. It could be a group message, or it could be another channel that you use. It's what's most reasonable for you to do, but you do need to provide them with some information, and the same for visitors as well, if you can. And before having people attend, tell them what measures you've got in place, and what they must do as well. So when they arrive, it's not a complete shock. When they arrive, they know what to expect. And remind the attendees as well that they will need to follow the wider national regulations and restrictions. And that can literally be that sentence, just saying, if you're going to visit, remember you must follow the national restrictions and guidance. It doesn't have to be complicated explaining what all of that is. You just need to say that you need to remind people that they have to think about that. And of course, completing the COVID risk assessment before the event. These are 3 things that you must do. A couple of other things to do before the event is think about when and where people will arrive. So does your event at the church hall have 1 car park? Does it have a couple of car parks? Is it a really small car park? Is there only 1 narrow alleyway where people can enter into the event and that jumble sale or that repair cafe? Think about the number of people that might attend, and think about staggering arrival times. So if it's possible to reduce the crowding and gathering of people. So the beach cleans and litter picks, if we're thinking about outdoor events, you might have quite a big car park out in the open. You might not have to do a lot there at all. You might not have to do anything because it's nice and wide and open. It might be enough to say, we know roughly this many people will attend, or you have a number of people that confirm they're going to attend. And if you know there's only going to be 10 or 15 people attending, the car park might be big enough that it's not a problem. If you're expecting 30 or 40 or 50 people, or you don't know, then it's worth staggering the arrival time somehow and confirming with batches of groups of people different times to arrive to make sure that you're not overloading that space all in one hit. So if you can use ticket sales, the event registrations, or booking slots to manage the number of people attending at different times, that's really worthwhile doing. So on arrival at the event, so you should turn away anyone who's showing symptoms. So the symptoms that we're talking about are the persistent cough, high temperature. Not so easy to tell if someone's got a high temperature. You're not expected to carry out temperature screening, but if somebody is coughing or if somebody appears to be physically ill, it's recommended that you take steps to turn that individual away. Use signage to set out the measures that you've got in place and the requirements that you have if people are going to enter that space or if they're going to attend the event, and take steps to prevent groups mixing. So again, signage to remind people that they should not be mixing in between groups. And when I say a group, we're talking about groups of 6 up to 6, or 2 family groups of more. So you might have 2 family groups that make maybe 8 or 10 individuals, for example. Take steps to reduce the need for queuing. So where queuing is necessary, use floor markings to support social distancing, and you can use signage to support that as well. So you could use strips of tape on the floor, you could use cones. So there's some simple things there that can be done if queuing is looking like it would be necessary or could occur. And make hand sanitizer and hand washing facilities available. So if you can make these available, then that's something that you should be doing as well. So facilities and equipment. So I've already spoken a little bit about thinking about toilet facilities and the additional cleaning that you should look to carry out there. Other things to think about, so for litter picking and gardening events, increase the frequency of tool cleaning. So where you can, if you can reduce the need to share tools, that's preferable. Is it possible for people to bring their own gardening tools? These are all the sorts of things that it's good to think about. Increased frequency of cleaning we've already touched on. If it's not possible to avoid the use of shared tools, so this is where we go back to the reasonably practical. If it's just not possible to avoid the use of shared tools, then you will need to think about carrying out additional cleaning. So can you provide some cleaning materials for people to use before and after they use tools? Can you or one of the volunteers or the group members carry out cleaning of those tools in between group sessions where they're being used? If possible, and this is not mandated, but if possible, it's good to try to leave shared tools 48 hours or so in between uses as an extra precaution. And again, use signage to remind people about using face coverings when indoor or when using indoor facilities and spaces. So if you are attending those litter picks or running litter picks and beach cleans, thinking about toilets in car parks, all of these facilities will be opening back up now. So that's important. So moving on to indoor activity types. So a reminder, talking about repair cafes, and this would be back indoors with repairers and attendees and visitors. So jumble sales, clothes swaps and swishes, training activities, so pack testing, bike maintenance, sewing skills and tool maintenance events and activities, potentially the library of things if people would be coming into that space to look at different items that they could potentially borrow. So these are all the key indoor activities we're talking about. And I'm sure there will be additional ones. We can certainly talk about those in the questions afterwards if you've got additional thoughts. Again, plan ahead. This is quite important for the indoor events. And the place to start with the indoor events is thinking about space. So there is no set figure on the number of people that you can have attending that event from the 17th of May. What you will need to think about is the amount of space that's available in that area. So in that church hall, in that village hall or school hall, think about the amount of space available and think about how you can manage that space to maintain social distancing. So for example, the repair cafe events, if you have 6 or 7 repairers, can you spread the repairers and their tables out in the room and still have a good 2-meter amount of space in between each different repair station? If that's not possible, then you'll need to look at having less repairers and less repair stations in that space. For jumble sales, you need to think about the number of tables that you can have set up and still maintain distance between the individual sellers. Because you are, or you would potentially be having different sellers fairly spaced out around a room, you might actually be able to have quite a good number of tables, but what you would then have to think about is the number of people attending. So you may need to restrict the number of visitors that you have entering that hall at any given time. So you may need to have a volunteer on the door who stops the number of people passing 10 or 6 that enter the room at any one time. So these are all things to think about. Ideally, you should try to provide instructions to attendees before they visit. So if you're planning an event, however you're communicating that that event is happening, at the same time, communicate, these are the things that you'll need to do. This is what we're doing, you'll need to do this. And at the minimum, it will be, you need to wear a face covering. But it might also be, you have to book a slot to come across to this event. So ticket the event or use the booking slots to stagger the arrivals and minimize the likelihood of queues forming. And that's another way that you're actually then enforcing a capacity limit on that space so that you're not getting flooded with 100 people at any given point, and you can manage people in ebbs and flows, as it were. You'll need to think about signage beforehand, so adding floor markings, and that can really be as simple as a bit of tape on the floor. Everybody knows what a piece of tape on the floor means now. You just need to have a sign at the beginning that says, please follow social distancing measures. You might want to add one-way systems. So for example, if you have a jumble sale set up, you could set that up in a U shape or a horseshoe shape or in an oval circuit shape, and have people only go around it in one direction. And these are all, that's quite an easy option. The other thing you'll need to think about is other areas of that space. So the hall itself might be nice and spacious, easy to ventilate, but a corridor going to a toilet might be quite narrow. So you may need to have a one-way system in there, or signage that says keep to the left or keep to right. And again, final thing you need to do when planning that event is complete the risk assessment. So indoor events, completing a risk assessment, that's a key step. On arrival, so once you start to have people arrive, again, for indoor events, you need to turn anyone away who is displaying clear COVID symptoms. For indoor events, test and trace for the NHS is going to be required. So it falls to the responsibility of community halls, for example. Community hall, whether or not they're hosting the event, the community hall must have test and trace themselves. Anyone operating an activity in the hall should also comply with test and trace. If the community hall is already running a test and trace system, they might be able to support you with doing that. There's two different options for the test and trace system. There's the QR code. So you may have seen these at the entrances of some shops and pubs that have now reopened, that before entering, you have to scan that with your smartphone. You need also to provide a paper recording system, or alternatively provide a paper recording system for doing that. And you just need to take the name of the person attending and a contact telephone number. That's an absolute minimum for the test and trace. If you are taking contact details on paper, then you'll need to think about other restrictions and regulations. So GDPR and data protection. You need to keep hold of that paperwork, or any paperwork you collect, for 21 days. So it might be yourselves that keeps hold of that, or it might be the community hall or the premises that you're at that is responsible for keeping hold of that. But someone will need to keep a record of who has attended that event given on that given day and those times. So this is a challenging step. I think this one is having this in place. The QR code system of managing it is an easy way of doing it, but not everyone has a smartphone. So to be inclusive, a paper recording system is a good idea as well. And again, the indoor events on arrival have signage instructing people to wear masks and follow the measures that you've got in place. Where possible, you'll need to manage the number and flow of visitors around those indoor spaces. That's really important if people aren't going to be seated. So for example, at a repair cafe, people will come in and they will be seated at a repair station. That's much more straightforward to manage. People coming into a jumble sale, they won't be seated, so you'll need to manage that somehow. And whether that's one person comes in, another person goes out, and you have a limit of, say, 6 or 10 people, you'll have to put something in place for that. And you'll need to decide based on the space that you're working with. There's no one magical number that says it can only be 10 or 20. You'll need to manage that based on the space. So during the event, excuse me, I'm just getting some more light. So during the event, you will need to take steps to stop groups mixing. So if you have people from the 17th of May at a repair cafe that are sat down at tables, they shouldn't be mixing with other people from other tables. So that is still a limitation that will apply from the 17th. If individuals, or if a group turns up to 6 people, then they could sit on one table with one repairer if they arrive as a single group. But other than that, you should stop different groups of tables mixing. You will be able to serve food and drink. If you are serving food and drink at repair cafes, there are a few other measures you'll need to take into consideration. So that's wherever the food and drink is being prepared, you'll have to have additional hygiene measures in place there. You should avoid communal use of condiments. So avoid them if you can, or use single disposable sets of condiments. Again, not ideal from a waste perspective. I can see some grimaces there, and I agree. If possible, or if not an option to use single or disposable sets of condiments, you will need to then provide additional cleaning for those, or additional hygiene measures there. And same again for indoor events. Carry out regular and additional cleaning of surfaces in areas where surfaces are likely to be touched and contacted. So toilets is an obvious one there, and keep a fixed schedule for doing that too. So here's an image I managed to find of a repair cafe with a screen in place. So great to be able to have a relatively close conversation and show the actual repair taking place and what's being done at the same time. So minimize contact between individuals. So in this case, a barrier is in place in between repairers and instructors. Provide additional hand sanitizer and wash facilities, and clean all surfaces between visits or visitors. Reduce mixing between volunteers if you can. So if you have a big event going on and you have 10 maybe or 15 or 20 different volunteers, you should try to keep the volunteers perhaps in pairs or reduce the amount of mixing between the different volunteers. So you might want to have fixed teams of volunteers. If you have a few people that are working just in the morning and different people in the afternoon, that's a good option possible. Those groups, keep them in small groups if you can, or break them up into smaller groups so that you don't have 10 or 15 volunteers all mixing together. If it's possible, consider, can you redesign an activity to maintain social distancing and minimize direct contact? So for example, the repair cafes amongst you that have got going have managed to do a click and collect sort of delivery repair cafe. There's other things you can do. So other activities that are taking place in person, for example, the bike maintenance that we have here, what you can do instead of showing people exactly what you're doing as you're doing it, or the individual providing instruction can explain what they're doing, and then they can step away. So you could say, I'm now going to step away 2 meters. If you individually, one by one, want to come and have a look at what's being done here, we'll then move forward to the next step. So thinking about how to design and change activities slightly is another option when it comes to indoor events and maintaining distancing. And reminding volunteers and visitors to reduce the surfaces and items that they touch if they possibly can. So if they can minimize those sort of contact points as well, that's all helpful. And remembering to manage other risks. So that's sort of the end of the indoor and outdoor risk management section. And I'm coming back to remembering to manage other risks and the other activity types that you do. So consider other risks being presented by existing and new activities. So if you start doing something new, then you need to obviously think about other risks being presented there, not just the COVID management risks. So think about traffic, vehicles, manual handling, electrical items, slips and trips, the list goes on. So that, I think, brings me to the end of my presentation, covering the important steps that you'll need to think about to get things going again. Thanks very much for listening. I think we're probably doing quite nicely on time. Helen, I don't know if we've had various questions coming in that you want to start with, or if people want to open.
Yeah, so first of all, Pete, a huge thank you for that. I mean, very comprehensive overview, and yeah, really lots of practical examples. So for me, for my brain, thinking about things I'm involved in my community, just really helpful to kind of start getting those processes going and be thinking about those steps that we need to be taking. So hopefully other people found it equally helpful. Roxy asked a question in the chat. There was only one in the chat, so I don't know whether other people are holding their breath. Do you want to stop screen sharing?
Yes, let me do that.
See everybody. And Roxy, if you'd like to unmute yourself and just pick up on the point that you put in the chat as starter for 10.
Yes, thank you. And I do have 2 other questions as well at some point. Could you expand a little bit on the point, or what you mean, sorry, by asking for views and feedback on COVID measures?
Yeah. So if you're managing volunteers, what you need to do is you need to first put together your ideas of how things will be managed at your events. So if you're doing a beach clean, what sort of event is it that you're thinking about, Roxy?
Oh gosh, lots of ones, but
okay,
now let's go with the growing project.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, so I take it gardening and using gardening tools and implements, those sorts of things?
Yeah, using gardening tools. We're growing loofahs, so we're trying to reduce the amount of plastic sponges
Oh, excellent. Okay.
Using. Yep. So by growing naturals fun.
Okay, so I mean, on your side, you've got there that you're working outdoors for most of that. So you'll need to have a think about any indoor spaces that you might be using. So if there's any toilets or any loo facilities that you'd be using, I don't know, portaloos or loos at allotments, those sorts of things, you'll need to think about those places and those areas, any handling of shared tools, and showing people and instructing people up close. Those are the sorts of things I'm guessing that you'll be doing. So you'll need to think about, okay, when you are doing those things, think about what you're going to put in place. And when you put those things in place, you can communicate in an email out to all volunteers to say, look, these are the sorts of things we're doing, or you can share the risk assessment that's been put together to share with the volunteers what's happening. You don't have to have people questioning and giving feedback, and they might not necessarily have wider views on COVID and their thoughts, but you're giving people an opportunity to ask questions, I suppose. And they might have questions, well, why are we doing it that way? Why are we not doing it this way? Is there something else we could do? Or a friend of mine is working with someone else in a different place. They're doing this. Can we do that? So that's the reason for sort of asking for feedback. Does that help, Roxy?
Yeah, I guess, yeah, it does. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, great.
Roxy, do you want to ask your next question?
Oh, yes.
And then Alex has popped a question in the chat. So Roxy, if we take your next question, and then if Alex wants to ask his question. That would be great.
Yeah, thank you. I just wondered, can you only use paper track and trace and sort of ditch the QR code thing? So I'm guessing you need some kind of machine or an app to be able to do it. And then the second part of that is what constitutes an indoor space. Like if I'm using a marquee, is that an indoor space?
No. So an indoor,
if it has three sides, is it indoor space? You know, like, yeah.
It has to have two sides. So if you're using a marquee, it becomes an indoor space if you have more than 50% of the walls on it. So if you only use two sides on it, it's an outdoor space still. So if you only have two sides on it, it's definitely an outdoor space, and you don't need to do test and trace. So it's when you make that an indoor space, you will need to do that. But yes, you can do it on just paper. You will you have to provide one. So you have to provide. Sorry, hang on, wait a minute. I think you have to provide at least paper. But if you have the app-based version, you do need the smartphone to do that, and you have to be issued with a QR code. So, and in the indoor space, so whoever owns or manages the indoor space, possibly the CAG group, would have to go onto the government website and request a QR code to be sent to them, and they'd get sent a QR code that they can print off, and they can stick that to a door, stick it to a desk. But yeah, you have to do at least paper, but paper is fine. If you're doing the paper, you do have to think about the GDPR side of things, which means that you've got to somehow keep that paper and those contact details secure. And I know Helen and I have got some other guidance on GDPR that we can share with groups to support on that. So, yeah. Is that all right, Roxy?
That's great. And I just realised that we might potentially use a bell tent that has like an open space and then sides that come up that sort of roll up. So yeah. That's probably an indoor space, isn't it? But,
I can check and look into that for you, but I think as long as the bell tent, you definitely would have to have the sides off that. I think that might be okay. Because I guess the sides are quite low to the ground, or the roof is quite low to the ground potentially. I can have a look into that, and I can make a note on that, and I can come back to you on that one, Roxy. Yep.
Okay, thanks.
But the marquee, 3 sides, is definitely outdoor space. Sorry, 2 sides. Yep. Great.
Alex, do you want to ask your question?
Sure, yeah. To introduce myself, I'm from the Ashburton Repair Cafe. One of our members wanted to know that at one stage it was believed it was necessary to wipe down anything, even shopping when it came into your home, and that seems to have gone out the window. When we're operating a drop and collect system for our repair cafe at the moment, and we're quarantining items for 3 days, although some other sites seem to suggest 2 days, but we've played it safe and gone for 3 days. Our question is it still necessary to spray down and quarantine items brought in for repair for 3 days? Or would that not be necessary if the repairer is wearing gloves and masks?
This is a really tricky one, Alex. And I remember I've seen, so Helen has shared your approach with me, and I looked in quite great detail through the risk assessment. The measures you've taken are definitely the right way to go. The measures you've taken are, if it's possible to do it, we're going to do this. So that's definitely the right approach to take. The evidence has become more and more vague on this in the past number of months, and originally they were saying you should definitely do this because we don't know enough about this virus, so you should just do it.
Right.
If you can keep doing it, I think it's a really good option to do it. If it's not practical to keep doing it, then I would suggest that you communicate to people that they should take steps to wipe down items when they take them away and take them back home. So if things are dropped off to you, if the steps that you take at that point are, before you do anything with those items, you immediately wipe them down and clean them, then I think that would be reasonable. But you would also need to advise people to do the same when they take things away. So if it's possible to keep doing it, I think that would be advisable. So it is definitely a grey area.
Yeah, it's certainly possible to keep on doing it. The problem is that you introduce delay in the entire repair cycle, don't you? Of 3 days on each side before the stuff even gets looked at and repaired and returned. It's yeah, okay. But I appreciate your reply. Thank you, Peter.
Yeah, you're quite right, Alex. And I mean, yes, you can literally go into a supermarket or a corner shop and pick up a pint of milk that has arrived on that shelf in the morning. So it's a really it's a bit of a tricky one, and I'm afraid there isn't a clearer answer on that. It's doing what you're able to do and what's reasonable. So yeah, you're welcome. Thanks, Alex. Oh, Helen, you're on mute. Oh.
I'm so religious about muting myself, I forget to unmute myself. Okay, so Katie's got a question, and then Bobby.
Is Katie there?
Bobby, do you want to ask yours?
Oh, she's there now. Sorry, I've got all my family congregating for supper, so I'm sort of trying to organise them. My question is it's not really to Peter, but it's to you, Helen, and it's about you said about templates. Do you have templates that?
Oh, we've lost you, Katie. We've lost your sound. Oh no. Oh, there you go. You're back.
Okay. I don't know where you got to then. So do you have templates available with exemplar templates that we can access?
I think I probably can answer. Oh, Helen, shall I?
Yeah.
Yes, you answer.
Yeah.
Okay.
We're in the process of finalising those, so they will be coming around fairly soon. So the hope is in the next week or two. Yeah, we've already got lots of the COVID measures in place, which we put in place going back to September and October. but it's been a case of having to revisit all of the guidance and then interpreting what the guidance means as we come out of lockdown. But yes, they will be available, and pretty much, yeah, here's what you need to do for all these steps. So yeah.
Was it me next then?
Yes, it is.
I think I know the answer to this, but I want to ask it anyway. Are the screens at repair cafes considered a kind of gold standard? Do we have to do it? Because obviously it's a cost and a storage issue, and
yeah, I can't see. So I think that there's a couple of ways of looking at this. So one of the aims of the repair cafes is to repair items for people. So you can repair items for people but not have the people there, so that the click and collect and the drop-off option has been a way of doing that at the moment. But what you lose there is you lose the ability to demonstrate and for people to show what's going on, and you lose the social connection there of that interaction too. If you're to bring that back in and have the repair cafes operating, you can still have an interaction, but if you don't have the screens, I don't think there's a way of doing that in close proximity to each other. Because if you don't have that screen, then people are automatically, you're going to be within 2 meters if you're looking at what somebody's doing with something fairly fiddly, if you know, if they're fixing a clock or doing a bit of soldering or something. So having that screen immediately, you can still be close, you can still see what's being done and learn and have that conversation and interaction, but the screen is giving the best possible protection in that situation. If you take away the screen, even if you're both wearing face coverings, you're probably within 1 meter, realistically, if you're sat at a table. So we really ought to be avoiding that, I think. And I think it's practical to avoid that. The other option is potentially to have a more distanced way of doing that repair and have 2 people sat at either end of a longer table, or have 2 tables that are back to back, or 2 thin tables that are 1.5 meters or 2 meters apart. But again, what you're doing is you're then separating the repair. So the individual visiting, if it's something small, might not be able to see the repair happening and to actually benefit really from that in the same way. So the screens, I think, unfortunately, the screens are really going to be a necessary item unless you really put the distance in between the repairer and the visitor. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
There may be, sorry, Bobby, there may be an option. I mentioned earlier to Helen about perspex screens. It might be possible to have a flexible screen made of flexible PVC or something similar. That material has been used in partitioning the cabs in vehicles and similar. So that might be another option. It would still need to be in some form of frame, and it would still need some, it would need cleaning in between each use, but it might be a little bit less expensive than acquiring perspex sheet. And there's no set standard for what those screens have to be. They just need to be that physical partition. So I'm sure you will have all seen different qualities of screens assembled together in various settings. So yeah.
Okay, thank you, Pete.
You're welcome. It's a really good question.
We did also ponder that actually of all our groups, repair cafes would probably best rise to the challenge of coming up with some sort of screen. Yeah, so maybe that's the repair cafe challenge for the next couple of months. Dee, you had a question about health issues. Would you like to share it with us?
There we are. I hope you can all hear me.
Yes.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about the health issues, because obviously you have problems with things like shops, with people saying that they're not going to wear masks, that they have a health issue. I mean, for example, my husband has emphysema and cancer, and so he has occasionally coughing fits and things. So, it's like, once somebody's in, do you go and ask them, and the issue about masking in the first place?
It's a really good point, and I don't think there's an easy answer to this. So the guidance the guidance sets out that you should take steps to refuse entry to people refusing to comply with the restrictions, so mask wearing. Now there are people who are exempt, as you've quite rightly said, so people with asthma as well can fall into this group. If people are arriving without masks on, I think it's reasonable to ask if they are exempt from wearing a mask because of a medical condition, or are they exempt from mask wearing. I think it's reasonable to ask that. If they state that they are, you're able to permit them. Everyone else inside the building should also be wearing masks as well. You should have your ventilation in the building as well. And also people, if they're attending for an indoor event, they're likely to be only attending that for a limited amount of time as well. So it's not ideal, but if there is an exemption in place, then people are permitted to do that and to not have a mask on. The other side of this is if people arrive at an event that's indoors and are refusing to wear a mask, they're not stating or confirming that they've got a medical condition, it's not up to you to be a bouncer either. So it's not up to the events to, and this is where the guidance contradicts itself, because it sets out that you should attempt to refuse entry to that individual, but at the same time, we don't want anybody to be putting themselves in a confrontational situation that could potentially turn aggressive or unpleasant. So I think the best way forward on that is to, if people don't seem to have a legitimate reason for not mask wearing and are not willing to comply, then it's absolutely reasonable to say that they're not going to be permitted entry. If at that point they want to continue and try to force entry, then fortunately that's the sort of point where you have to take a stance of whether or not the authorities are contacted about it and notified that somebody's attending. I think the hope would be that most people will be reasonable, but it's wise to have in mind about hopefully a very small minority that might not be willing to comply. Is that helpful, Dee?
Yeah, because I mean, we've been so socially isolated for the past year. I'm not actually used to going into things like shops or anything anymore. I mean, do people who have an exemption, do they have can they have a card or anything like that?
I don't think so. I don't think there's any specific need for them to carry anything or prove anything and evidence anything. And I think beyond politely asking if someone has an exemption, you can't demand to see evidence of it either. So there isn't particularly anything to help anyone out in the shop and event situations like that. It's unfortunately something which isn't that easy to deal with. So yeah, I'm afraid I haven't got a better answer on that one.
Well, thank you anyway.
Okay, you're welcome.
Okay, so that's all the questions that we've picked up from the chat. So I'm just going to open it out now to anybody if they've got any other questions about anything that Pete's talked about or anything that you hoped he'd talk about that perhaps you didn't hear, then just put your hand up and Katie, do you want to kick off?
Please. I wasn't aware of the screens situation, so that's sort of put a bit of a quandary up there. What sort of size? What's the average size that these screens should be?
I don't think there's a specific size.
No. Okay.
No, there aren't prescriptive things in place, but if you've got, so is this for a repair cafe, Katie?
Yes. Yeah.
So I think it's reasonable if you've got someone sat at a table, if it's only going to be one person on the other side of the table or potentially a couple of individuals at the side of that on the other side of the table, you just need to have a think about what's a reasonable width.
Right. Okay.
To provide a barrier.
Okay.
It needs to be at least above the head height of someone sat down, but it doesn't. If both people are sat down, there's no need for that partition to be 2 meters high above the table. That wouldn't be necessary.
Okay. All right. Okay, thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. Okay.
I'm going to go to Stefan and then Roxy.
Am I unmuted?
Spot on.
Just a couple of things. One, when we're able to start up again in a parish or village hall, you were saying, I believe, that most the onus would be then on the people that you're hiring the hall from, Peter. So it's their in their remit to provide the click and trace situation and all the other measures that need to be taken, or are those upon yourselves? Because you're actually hiring the premises. So normally you'd hire the premises and pay for the premises and just utilize that for your facility within. So would they have to put the sort of wipes and masks and things in place? Or would it be up to yourselves running the event? That's the first one.
It's a good question. So the legal onus is on the facility being provided. Yeah, the legal onus is on the owner of the facility. So the person providing the group, the organisation or village hall that's being provided, the onus for test and trace, they have to do it. So in the guidance, the actual owner of that facility and premises has to be involved in test and trace. It's a little bit less clear whether you then have to double up as the individual group, or whether you would then lead on the management of test and trace on the day. If the community hall, for example, was to turn around and say, we've got a QR code and there's some paper there, but we're not going to have anyone here to make sure that it gets filled in, then potentially there could be repercussions that negatively affect on you guys as a group. So this is where it all gets a bit grey, and it would be advisable that the group takes responsibility on the day to make sure that everything is done right. In terms of the equipment being provided, so social distancing measures and hand wash and signage, the premises, in theory, should be responsible for doing some of that. But I think what we will see happen is lots of grey areas where the facility goes, you don't have the resources to actually do this. And if they say that, then you're sort of left in a position whether, well, actually either we do this to make sure the event happens, or we try to strong arm them into doing it to make sure the event happens. And if they're really not able to do it, then you might not be able to hire the hall from them, or they might just say, we just can't do this. So I think it's worth seeing what's possible. So talk to the parish hall and see what they're able to do, what they're willing to do. If they're running lots and lots of different events anyway, then there's a chance that they will already have some of this stuff in place. So some signage, some queuing outside, additional hand wash, they might already have some of these things in place. So it's, yeah, unfortunately, I think it's going to be a case for lots of different premises of trying to work things out with individual groups.
Right, they're actually doing that already, because they are actually, I've actually put the next repair cafe on the 24th of July, but they're already saying to me that they run, this is a Hemingway Parish Hall in Devon, and they actually run a farmers market, which they run usually, they're going to start in September. So it may not be that we can start with a repair cafe until then anyway.
Okay.
But I thought that might be the case, that if they've already got something going on, they've already got signage and things in place to cover that sort of event for the way that people move around. But it's just because when the tables and everything is set up for repair cafe, it might be a bit different, as you say.
Exactly.
Yeah. Can I just add a quick one on, as you know, I think, you know, and you know with Helen, certainly I'd spent a lot of time writing a risk assessment to do this facility I'm offering from a hub from my home, and done extremely well on the number of events that we've been offering. And I do carry out meticulously what we've written into the risk assessment, whereby I spray every item, like the other gentleman was just saying earlier on, that they're still not doing. We still do that actually when we get our deliveries from our suppliers. I look at two products I've got in front of me, and I've actually looked at the Dettol, to tell everybody, the Dettol Super Clean product. There's an active ingredient in this product, which actually the active ingredient is more powerful within the actual Tesco product, which is benzalkonium chloride, which is actually at 0.06% in the Dettol product, but in Tesco product is 1.8%, so it's double the strength. And they do actually say, if you read on the back of these, the whole description, it actually says it does, it's for human coronavirus pores as well. So it covers the whole thing. So these are good products. And these are the products that I've been utilizing to spray on a cloth when I can't spray it on the item. It's mainly plastics or plastics things. And then clean everything off before I move it at all myself, wearing goggles, a shield and gloves and a coat. And then when I pass it to my repairers, I then drum it to them, pass it to them, hand it over. When I collect, I do the same thing again before I pass it back to my client.
I mean, that is the absolute best scenario, Stefan. If you're able to do that, then you're covering all angles and all possible chances. It's very difficult on the item handling, and there hasn't really been any more clear guidance on it, because there hasn't really been any more work on it. If there has been work, it's not really been communicated.
No.
The likelihood of it spreading from items.
Yes.
It seems to be the case that it's less likely. But if you can do that, Stefan, that's definitely the best thing to do.
We found that completely workable. It was impractical the way we discussed that, obviously with yourselves and through Helen, to work on 72 hours. I just couldn't do that. You know, it was impractical to work that way, and this works very well indeed. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Stefan. Okay, Roxy, and then Kate wants to come back in with a question around the screens again, and then I'm just conscious of time. And then Alex, I've just seen has put a question in. So Roxy, Kate, Alex, and then we might have to wrap up unless anyone else has got to burn it on Bobby. Okay, you're going to have to keep them quick and punchy.
Yep, I'll try and reply quickly as well.
Okay, so we're looking to hold some outdoor event in summer, but I'm just thinking about where we're looking to hold it, which is on the beach, hopefully, and also, or potentially on the beach and on the den, which is like a green space. So yeah, just thinking about managing that in terms of the public and sort of the integration between the public and people that might come to the event. And then also a part of that we would like to do, alongside talks about microplastics, and we'll do sea shanties. So do you have any thoughts on singing? Because I heard something about COVID and singing, and there was a problem with people joining in, and yeah, how does that happen?
I'm afraid I think Helen is right on the singing. I think singing is probably a big thumbs down, certainly in groups. One of the pieces of guidance is if you're holding an indoor event, is not to have loud music playing or have anything noisy that would mean people are raising their voices. If people are raising their voices and shouting more, then there's the potential for particles and droplets to be projected further, even with face coverings. So singing is generally a bit of a no-no, certainly indoors. Outdoors, it depends on when you're planning your event. It could be that by the time you're planning your event, every restriction has been lifted, so it may no longer apply. But certainly May up until June, I think singing is probably off the cards. Other points, dealing with the public, you do need to be mindful if you're hosting events out and about, the general public that might be there. So you may need to make sure that your groups or kind of smaller groups within that are gathering in such a way that doesn't overwhelm other public spaces or take up or end up being too close to other members of the public. So you will need to think about how many people are attending those events and how spread out people are. So they're things to think of. And either you need to set limits on that, or you need to make it very clear to people that are attending what they can and can't do in terms of group numbers and interacting. Is that okay, Roxy?
Yeah, that sounds good. I guess like big signs or something as they approach.
Yeah.
Because if it's the public and we can't always tell them because they might just drop on by. So yeah. No,
exactly. And the public will do as the public want. If it's an outdoor public space, you'll have to be mindful that you aren't in a position to manage them, I guess is the point. Who is next? I've forgotten.
Kate is next.
Katie? Yep, Katie.
Kate?
Oh, who's Kate?
Well, actually, yes, you. So you put your question in. You put your question in the chat. Actually, it was about screens.
Oh yeah, sorry. So literally, it was any screens until the 21st of June, is it? Or
yeah, for repair cafe events, it will be. Yeah. Something that's occurred to me with screens. Now, I mentioned about the use of PVC. There's no reason that you couldn't get creative. As long as what you do is safe in other reasons, I don't see any reason why you couldn't use something like an old shower panel or an old bath panel, as long as it was held secure and it was safe and didn't present other risks in that sense, then that's something potentially that could be used. You could be creative. And this is what I said about managing other risks as well. You still need to think about, is everything else safe and fit for purpose in other ways as well? But it doesn't have to be a sheet of Perspex or a sheet of plastic. It could be something else clear and transparent, as long as it's safe in other ways.
thank you.
Lovely, great. Okay, I'm going to do it really quickly now. So Alex had one. Do you want to say it, or shall I just read it out?
No, I'll be really quick. I'm involved with the Ashburton Community Fridge as well. We were using dilute vinegar spray to disinfect the fridge and the handles and whatnot. That's dilute vinegar, what do you call it? Pickling vinegar, clear vinegar, not balsamic, definitely not. We've been told that this is not acceptable as a disinfectant. We can't get any clear guidance on it.
I think Alex, you would need to use products that are definitely confirmed as effective, or as are definitely sold and branded and marketed as antibacterial, antiviral. So I would definitely use products where that's recognised.
Because they're not very nice, are they?
They're not ideal, but the
business. Okay.
Unfortunately, in the kind of the grand scheme of what we have to do to manage health and safety as effectively as possible, I think that's the route to take, unfortunately. I completely agree with you.
Thank you very much, Peter. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Alex. Bobby.
Oh yeah, hello. It was not really a question, more of a kind of just to raise it really. We were talking about wiping down items, but of course you can't wipe down textiles very easily. They're not an easy surface to wipe down. So it's just recognizing the difference between different products. I mean, Stefan might, as he's been running his.
It's a good, yeah, it's a good point. So the recommendation on textiles. So there's no further proof or evidence either way that suggests it's more likely to be transmitted on textiles. It seems from the last work that was done that it's mostly on hard surfaces like plastic and metals that it's transmitted best. But as a precautionary measure, it's advisable to bring items that have been isolated for a period of time. So charity shops, for example, the guidance there is that if you're taking items to a charity shop, put them in the bag, leave them for a couple of days, then take them to the charity shop. And charity shops, where possible, should do the same on the other side, leave it for a couple of days. So that's a general kind of precautionary measure. If you're having a jumble sale, if you're having a car boot, signage to suggest that people don't handle items unless they intend to buy them. Now, you're not going to be able to get everyone to do that for all of the time, but it's a recommendation and guidance. Get people to use additional hand sanitizer in between. And if people are buying items, include a line on your signage that says you should keep this isolated, or recommend you keep this isolated for a couple of days after buying. And that's a reasonable step to suggest what people ought to do.
Link to that, sorry, I know you're running out of time. Really
That's okay.
If you're doing a jumble trail, should everyone taking part have some hand sanitizer on their table then, really?
I would recommend it. I would recommend it. I think it's a sensible thing to do, and should be manageable, I think. So yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Great. Lovely. Well, that is perfect timing because I make it 20:31. So I'd just like to wrap up by saying, well, actually, there's a couple of things I want to do. One of them, I've got a cat outside my window here. That's not what I wanted to do. I'm going to relaunch. I've never seen whether this works, but I'm going to I'm going to set you that question again whilst I'm talking through the kind of next steps. But first of all, a massive thanks to Pete for a very comprehensive talk and fielding all those questions without blinking, without hesitation, without repetition. Is that the three things?
Deliberation.
More than a minute, but so a massive thank you to Pete. And I would say definitely over the past year, in terms of keeping the CAG groups going, he's played such an important role. So thank you. In terms of next steps, we've talked about the templates, and the templates will be available in the next week or so. They will either be, I haven't decided yet, circulated to you or put up on the CAG Devon website, which might be an easier way for everybody to access them. We're also going to follow up this evening's session with a clinic, a one-to-one clinic. So Pete's kind of going to put himself in the hot seat again. And if you've got specific questions about a risk assessment for an event that you're planning in the next period, then you can book a slot with him and share, have a conversation and talk through those exact issues. So really tailored support there as well. We'll be sending out a set of slides. We'll also be sending out the link to the recording of this session, which will be going onto the CAG Devon YouTube channel. And then, as I say, one-to-one feedback about your risk assessments. Please base them on the templates that we're going to share with you. It will make life a lot easier. So so they're the kind of next steps. I'm going to end the polling and share the results with you. Ba, ba, ba. That looks like a pretty good outcome.
A bit more confidence, hopefully.
Yeah, we've got one person feeling more daunted though.
Okay. Not the desired effect, but if you've got additional questions, if you channel them to Helen in between or before I do that next clinic, I'm more than happy to come back with responses if there's things we can help with. The work you guys are doing to get items reused, to get people involved and passionate about recycling and diverting from waste is great, and it's really worthwhile. So well done everyone on coming along tonight and hopefully getting things going again. It's great.
Absolutely. And Stefan's wiggling his finger. Is that Justin? Yes.
So I'm unmuted. Can I finally, just for yourself, and I'm trying to get hold of you, is there any chance to get, just sorry, this is something to do with CAG, but can I get hold of you tomorrow, please?
Let's talk about this. Let's email separately about this because I don't work on Fridays.
Right, but I'd just like to talk to you. Okay, thank you.
That's fine. No problem.
Okay.
Okay, anybody else? Any last comments?
Just to say a huge thank you, Pete and Helen. That's really useful, really useful.
Most welcome. Pleasure.
Brilliant. A few thumbs up. Good to see you all. Onwards, upwards, and out. Yay.
All the best.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.